This is an old program that I have pulled up to show you how we have been running the Flask application or the Python Flask application so far. As you already know that I'm using PyCharm IDE, and running program has been pretty easy because I create the program and then press on this play button and the program starts executing. So it is giving some error saying that the file is not available, which is ho06 flask caching.py, and my intention is not to run this program. So if it is a new program, I'll have to right click and then click on run, and this is how we have been running all the programs. But as you might already know that this is not how we would be running or deploying a Python Flask application or any application for that matter in production. So what is the way to execute Flask applications in production server without using PyCharm? There are few things. I'll be talking about development server or maybe system integration testing or UAT testing server, wherein you'll be deploying the Flask application the way that I'll be discussing now. But in production application, obviously, you will be using app server, which we'll discuss shortly. But let's say I have to run the Flask application without using any IDE. I have done my development, I have executed my code, I have done the unit testing. Now it is time for, let's say, system integration testing or integration testing. So I want to run my code and keep it up and running so that other APIs or other programs can communicate to it to see whether everything is working or not. The first way to do this is using something called Flask underscore app variable. And what we do is that we export the Flask underscore app variable and we mention the name of the script in this variable, and then we run the command flask run. And if we use flask run, it would run in the foreground. If you want to run it in the background, then we'll use no hope flask run ampersand in Linux. These are the steps. The first is export the Flask app variable in Linux. If it is Windows, you'll use the set command, and then you'll use Flask run. We can mention port number also. So if you're running, let's say, multiple functions on the same machine or on the same server, obviously Flask run would not work. Then what would happen? We'll set the Flask underscore app variable. Let's say we have two scripts, Flask app1.py and Flask app2.py. First, we'll export the variable flask underscore app with the flask app1.py program. Then we'll run this program in port number 8001. After the execution starts, we'll again export the variable or change the variable. Now flask underscore app variable would contain flask app2.py program, and then if you use flask run followed by the port number, then the second code would be running on port number 8002. So this is how we typically run Flask application, or this is how we execute Flask application or Flask script. And the question is, how do we deploy a Flask application? Let's say we want to deploy Flask application in an app server. Obviously, we do not run it like the way I have been showing you, or even using the previous slide that I have shown you. That is not how we run any web application. To run web application or web service, we need web server or application server. So if you want to run web application, then we'll be using web server. And if you want to run web service or APIs, then we'll need application server. As I'm talking about Flask in the purview of web service or API only, so I'll talk about how to deploy Flask application in an app server or application server. So as I said, we use application server or app server, and let's say you want to deploy it yourself. There are multiple application servers available. The most famous one is Unicorn or G-Unicorn. Then you have UWSGI. WSGI is Web Server Gateway Interface, which is a framework which provides the deployment of web applications and web servers. Likewise, we have other library also like mod underscore WSGI and few other app servers also. If you want to deploy it in cloud, then we'll use either ECS or EKS or EC2 or Google Compute Engine or GKE, etc. But if you want to deploy it using your own app server, then you would use any one of these. So I'll show you using G-Unicorn. First, of course, you'll have to install the app server using PIP or PIP3. And there are certain parameters that we have to provide, like -w and -b. -w is the number of processes that will run on the application server. If you mention -w equal to 4, let's say, what would happen is the same application would be running using 4 different cores or 4 different processors. Why do you do it? Because if you have an application server, or if you have a server wherein you have multiple cores or multiple processors rather, you want to run the application parallelly using all the processors. So that's where we'll use -w. And -b is providing the server socket for binding, which is equivalent to what we have been using for host and port. And this is the command gunicorn -w4 -b followed by the host or the bind IP and the port number, and then we run the Flask application. What will I do is that in the hands-on, I will host Flask application using an app server in my local machine. But obviously, that is not something that we want to do. We want to run it on cloud. So I'll be using AWS EC2 instances first to deploy these applications. Now, before starting the hands-on, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the integration of Python with Flask. You do not have to worry about it. All the Python features and functionalities are available with Flask also. Flask is just an additional library which extends the functionality of a Python program so that it becomes an API or a web service. Flask does not take away any features or functionalities of Python for that matter. So multi-threading, database libraries, web application, data engineering libraries, machine learning libraries, etc., all the libraries and all the features of Python are available with Flask also. So it does not take away any feature of Python for that matter. So let's do the hands-on. What am I going to do is that I'll be starting 2 Flask applications, Flask app 1 and Flask app 2 in my local machine. First, I'll run these 2 applications on my local machine without any app server. Just want to show you how we can use the Flask_app variable to run these applications. Then I will install gunicorn on my machine, and then we'll run the same applications using gunicorn. Again, this will be on my machine. But obviously, this is not how we deploy it in production. Typically, we use virtual machines provided by cloud providers or virtual servers. So I'll be launching an EC2 instance on AWS, or if you want, you can launch a Google Compute Engine on GCP or Azure VM on Microsoft Azure. Any one is fine. I'll be using EC2 instance. Then I'll install gunicorn to run the 2 codes or the 2 scripts, Flask app 1 and Flask app 2 on 2 different EC2 instances. And then I'll use Postman to send requests to the APIs which are hosted on these EC2 instances. This is the same application that I had shown you at the beginning of this course, wherein I'm using list products API and product detail API, and I'm enforcing the data type, and I'll be passing the product ID. So I have divided that program into 2 different parts. The first one is Flask app 1 and the second one is Flask app 2. In Flask app 2, I'll be sending product detail and one of the columns. This is the second application, and the first application is this one. And I'll run it using the ID itself, and it is running on port number 8000. And using Postman, I'll be sending list products, which is showing us all the products, and let's try to get one of the product details, which is product detail. As I send the product ID, I'm able to get the output, which is the price, quantity, and supplier. And same would be the case with the second API also, and it is giving some error because I have first of all not started this program, and even if I start, it will give error because it will say port 8000 is already in use. So I'll have to change it here and then start it again. So I'm running 2 applications, as you can see. One is the Flask app 1 and the second one is Flask app 2. So it is pretty easy from the ID, right? So we just start it. Let's see whether it works or not. So let's try to find out the price of all the products, and it is showing me the product ID, product name, and price. So this is working. What will I do now is that I'll stop both the apps from here and I'll run it using terminal. using the flask underscore app variable. Now there's a prerequisite to use that variable. First of all, we cannot use names like ho.07.1.flaskapp1. So we'll have to copy and paste it and rename it. And I'll just name it as flaskapp1.py. Same would be for the second one also. I'll name it as flaskapp2.py. I have just renamed them or copied them. Now I'll have to open the terminal and export Flask app and then try it out. First of all, can I use my global terminal? So let's try Flask run, and it says the Flask command not found. Why this is the case? The concept actually goes back to the Python basics wherein I talked about virtual environment. I did not install the Flask library globally, but I installed it in a virtual environment in that particular folder only. What I mean by that is we have Flask only in the library of the virtual environment, which is here. I have not installed Flask outside of it. I have not installed it in my local machine per se. I have installed it in the virtual environment, which is there in the folder API using Python Flask. So there are two ways to do it. One is that we'll have to change this Python execution environment to the virtual environment. We can do that using source command, and I'll have to pass the Python executable, which is this one. So what I have to do is that I'll have to activate the Python executable, which is there in this virtual environment. Otherwise, it will not work, which is there in the bin library. And actually, the command is source, not activate. Sorry, my bad. And now if you see, I am in the virtual environment, and now I can use this flask run command. It will not give you error saying that the flask run command not found. So I can use, or I can run the program here. Or if you do not want to do all these things, you can open a terminal here itself in the ID PyCharm. Click on terminal, and here you can export the flask variable and then run it. Okay, but let's go ahead and execute it using the terminal. So I'll export flask underscore app equal to the first one, which is flask app1.py. And now I'll have to use flask run, and then I'll have to mention the port number. If I do not mention port number, what would happen is that it would run in port number 8000. Now, if you say I'm getting this error, why am I getting this error? It is saying could not import Flask app1. The reason is that I'm in a different directory. So I'll have to go to the directory where my code is, and the code should be here, which is flask app1.py. And now if I use Flask run, it is running in port number 5000, not on 8000. Remember, because what happened is in the code flask app1.py, I have mentioned port number 8000, but it is not running on port number 8000. It is running on port number 5000, because if you run it using this flask run command, that is the default. We can change the default by mentioning port equal to the port number that you want to run it on. So now it is running on port number 8001. So this is the first application that has run. Again, it is running on foreground. If I type Control C, the Flask application would stop running. So let me just run it and show you what I mean by that. Now if I run this API, list products on port number 8001, it is working as usual. Now I'll type Control C. Now it will say that the server is not running because the execution stopped. So if you are using this Flask run -- port 8001, you'll have to make sure that a screen is running all the time. There's a way to work around this. In Linux machines, we have something called background run, and we'll do that shortly. But first, let us go ahead and run the other application also. I'll open a new terminal, and here also I'll source the Python binary, which is there in the virtual environment. So now I am in the virtual environment. Here also I'll export the variable flask underscore app to the second application, which is flask app2.py. And now if I use flask run, followed by the port number. I'll mention a different port number here, 8002. Now this would run on port number 2. Again, I'm getting the same error, could not import Flask 2 because I might be in a different directory. So let's look at the directory. As you can see, it's a different directory altogether. So let's go to the directory where the program actually is, which is this one. And let's see whether the Flask 2 app is there or not. I can see it here. And now if I run it, Flask 2 app is running. So both the apps are running on the same machine. First, let me try it out using Postman. In the first one, we have list products and I think product detail followed by the product ID, let's say 43671. And I should get the product information of this product ID 4371. So this is the first one. And the second one is product detail and only, let's say, the price. And you can see the price of all the products, maybe quantity also. And I can see the quantity of all the products that we have. So both are working. And this is how we can run multiple Flask applications in the same machine or in the same server. And I'm running it in the foreground. So if let's say I close this without even pressing Control C and now try it out, it will say that the server is not running, the API is not running, or the web service is not running. The reason I have closed the window. So that is not something that we should do. We should not run it in foreground. So there's a command called nohoop or no hangup in Linux machines, and what we do is that we use this option to run a code. So in that case, what would happen? The code would run in the background and it will not get terminated even if you close the terminal. But before that, let's see what is the Flask app variable is set to. And it is set to Flask app 1. So let's run Flask run, and this is how we run it. No hoop Flask run ampersand. Now it is appending the output. It is actually running. Flask app 1 is actually running. Console. This is 8001 and list products. So it is running in port number 5000. My bad. That's why the error is coming. First, I'll have to stop the Flask application. To do that, get the process ID of the Flask application. This is the Flask run command and this is the process ID. Let me first kill it or terminate the process. Now it is gone. So let me run the Flask application again in port number 8001. So now it is running in the background and it is working. Let me close the terminal and let me send the request. Even then it is running because it is running in the background. Now let's run the second one. First I'll have to set the Flask app variable, Flask app 2.py, and I'll run it in the background again, but using port number 8002. Okay, it seems like it failed. So no such file or directory. Sorry, my bad. I did not activate it. And my current working directory is API using Flask. Now it should work and it is working as usual. Let's try it out anyway. I want to get the quantity and the quantity is getting returned. So I have run both the Flask application in the same machine using Flask underscore app variable and using Flask run command. As I had two different applications or two different scripts, I had to run them in two different ports. I cannot run them in the same port. Alright, now the next thing is I'll obviously stop the application and I'll run it using an app server, which is GUnicorn. Before running it in GUnicorn, I have made some changes. In Flask app 1, instead of naming it as app, I have named it as app 1. And obviously I have changed it everywhere, app1.route, app1.route and app1.run. Same is the case for the second app also. Here I would change the name to app2 and I'll change it everywhere as app2 and app2.run. The reason I have made this change is because the way you pass it in GUnicorn is a little different, and I wanted to show you the difference. Now the first thing that I have to do is that I'll have to install GUnicorn. Either you can install it using the terminal here in the IDE, or we can install here also pip install GUnicorn. I have already installed it, so it'll say that the requirement is already satisfied. So the GUnicorn is already there. It has already been installed. Now, how do I run it? I do not have to set any variable for this. I'll run it using G unicorn dash W. I'll tell you what W is, dash B. Now, this B is similar to host and port that we had discussed earlier. And then I'll have to run the app. So this is how you run using GUnicorn, as simple as that. You install it and run it, and you have to make sure that this is running all the time. And here I'll have to mention Flask app 1 and not.py colon and the name of the Flask app. So that's why I changed it. I changed it to app 1 for the first case, and it is running, as you can see. First, let me check whether it is running or not. It is running on port number 9001. Once I see that it is actually running, then I'll come back and discuss all these things. So in port number now 9001, I should have list products, and it is giving me the output. And if I, let's say, take a product 4851, it should show me the output of that product also. It is not list products. The API is product detail, and I can see the output. So the first application is running. So let's go to GUnicorn and see or explore some of the options. This option dash W is the number of worker processes. How many processes are running this particular app? Now, what is happening is that in my machine, as I have multiple processors, 4 processors are using to run the same app, which is Flask app 1.python, and it is showing you the process ID also 3374, 75, 76 and 77. These are the PIDs or the process IDs which are getting used to run all these 4 applications. Is the same code but running 4 times. Let me show you that. The command is ps.ef grep flask, and here, as you can see, I have this first GUnicorn, second GUnicorn, third and fourth. And look at the process ID 33762334 as shown here, and the main process is 3373, and 3373 is the actual Flask app 1 that I executed. Is it running parallelly? Is it running using different process IDs? How can I check that? So for that, I'll have to change the code a little bit. I'll have to modify it. I'll have to import a library called OS, which is an operating system library. And here I will mention PID as os.getPID, and I'll print the process ID also. So it has been saved. Now it will not be dynamically loaded. Remember that. If I send it, I cannot see the OS process ID. So I'll have to stop the application, or stop the app server rather, and start it back again. And now the changes would be applied. So the reloading does not happen dynamically. There's an option which can be provided which will automatically reload also. The changes would be captured during runtime dynamically. But I'm not showing you that. Now if I send it, I am seeing the OS process ID, and see every time it is different, 34030102. So as you can see that every request is going to different processes. Now imagine that I have 400 API or 400 HTTP requests coming in. These 4 processes would handle maybe 100 API requests or HTTP requests individually. So providing parallel processing for the Flask API or for the web service. Likewise, I can run the second application also. It has to be in a different terminal, and it would be Flask app 2, which is the name of the application, or name of the code actually. Name of the code minus the .py extension. So it is Flask app 2 and the object which was created using the Flask class, and that is app 2. Sorry, I'll have to source it again. Now it is running on port number 9001, but it is giving error because port number 9001 is already getting used, so we'll have to change it obviously. So let's change it to 9002, and it is running on 9002. Let's get the product detail category, and it should work as usual. It should be 9002, and I can see the category of all the products. If you want, you can print the process ID, operating system process ID also, but I'm not doing it. I hope you know what I mean. So this is also running using 4 different processes parallelly, And the process IDs are shown here, which is 3415 to 3418. So parallel execution is happening. Now I can actually use Control C to stop the execution. And if I use no hope, again, what is happening is it will be run in the background. So category is working. Same is the case with price. Created at, I guess, was the other one. Created, actually, it's not created at, which is also working. And then the supplier. This is the last one that we created. So it is working in the background also. Similarly, we can run it, or we can run the other application also in the background from the same terminal. And it is running. Let's try it out. It should be 9001 and we can see the output. Let's see 4950 whether it works or not. It's not list products. The API is product detail and it is working. So this is how we can use app server, gunicorn app server, to execute the code on a machine as an app server, right? So that's all about executing in the local machine. So let us go ahead and launch an EC2 instance on AWS, and we'll do the same. We'll host the same APIs or the same web services on EC2 instances, two different EC2 instances, and I'll use Postman to connect to the API which is there on those EC2 instances.